Long before the name of Germany existed as a unified nation, the Prussian martial spirit had forged a tradition that would shape the character of its future generals. Prussia, under Frederick the Great, turned the art of war into a science. In its academies, a doctrine was cultivated where order, obedience, and precision were sacred virtues. The uniform was a symbol of social distinction and military service, a way of life. The Prussian army was not an instrument of the state, it was the state itself. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Prussian officer corps consolidated itself as a closed aristocracy, mostly from rural noble families. The Junkers, they considered war a natural extension of government. They were cold, disciplined, and distant from the common folk. Strategy, planning, and tactics were studied meticulously in institutions like the Kriegsakademie of Berlin, the cradle of an elite that believed courage and reason must coexist on the battlefield. Prussian victory over Austria in 1866 and France in 1871 confirmed this supremacy. General Helmuth von Moltke, nicknamed the Old, became a symbol of this mentality: calculation, mobility, and precision. His famous phrase, "No plan survives contact with the enemy," would become the eternal motto of German general staffs. The unification of the empire under Bismarck consolidated the army as the backbone of the new Germany, with a structure that answered directly to the Kaiser, not Parliament. This separation between civil and military power would mark the country's destiny in the coming decades. The future generals of World War II grew up in this mold. Their fathers had served under the Imperial Eagle, and many received their education in academies that still venerated the manuals of Moltke and Clausewitz. Military thinking was based on the idea of war as a rational, inevitable, and noble phenomenon. The notion of defeat was inconceivable, for discipline had to be imposed even on logic. When World War I broke out, that old officer corps faced an enemy it did not understand: modern industrial warfare. The romanticism of mounted command and heroic charges collided with artillery, gas, and trenches. However, the experience forged a new generation of officers composed of young captains and lieutenants who learned from the mistakes of their superiors and understood the value of mobility and technology. Among them were names that decades later would dominate the battlefields of Europe: Erich von Manstein, Heinz Guderian, Walter Model, Friedrich Paulus, and Erwin Rommel, among others. World War I destroyed the old order but left its spirit intact. After the defeat of 1918, many officers maintained the belief that the army had not been beaten on the battlefield but betrayed by the civilian politicians. This idea, which mutated into a myth widely spread among both military and civilians, remembered as the stab in the back, became a conviction that fueled national resentment and prepared the ground for a future revenge. In cafes and veteran associations, the old glories of the General Staff recalled the days of Prussian glory and dreamed of the rebirth of military power. The German army, still mutilated by defeat, remained the direct heir of that Prussian tradition, an institution that saw itself as above politics and as the guardian of the national spirit. Its generals believed that absolute obedience to command was the foundation of civilization, even when the command was wrong. That tacit oath of loyalty to the state, not to a leader, would soon be put to the test. The end of the empire and the arrival of the Weimar Republic did not alter this mentality. In the shadows, military academies continued to transmit the lessons of Moltke and Schlieffen. Old photographs of imperial parades decorated the offices of Reichswehr officers. And while Germany struggled in poverty and instability, a new generation of soldiers dreamed of recovering the lost greatness. Prussian pride survived the collapse. But now, without a Kaiser to lead them or an empire to defend, the German generals found themselves orphaned of cause. The impact of the Treaty of Versailles and the reduction of the German army. On June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the same place where half a century earlier the German Empire had been proclaimed, the representatives of a defeated Germany signed a document that sealed their humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles not only dismembered its territory and economy, but also struck directly at the heart of its pride, the army. The Reichswehr, successor to the old Imperial Army, was limited to 100,000 men. It received harsh restrictions, such as the categorical prohibition of possessing heavy artillery, tanks, aircraft, submarines, and above all, a general staff considered by the Allies to be the brain of the Prussian war machine. Germany, defeated and humiliated, was condemned to become a disarmed nation, monitored by the victors. For the old officer corps, this was a devastating moral blow. Career officers with decades of service were forced to retire, and those who remained were required to command skeletal units in a country fragmented by misery. The humiliation was public. Every parade, every uniform, every insignia had to be approved by the victorious powers. The army, which had for centuries embodied the national spirit, was now a soulless body. However, beneath that surface of formal obedience, the Prussian tradition survived. The new leaders of the Reichswehr, such as Hans von Seeckt, former Chief of Staff of the 11th Army on the Eastern Front, understood that although they could not openly defy the treaty, they could prepare for the future. Von Seeckt reorganized the army into a professional, select, and highly disciplined force. His motto was clear: it is not necessary to have a large army, but a quality army. Young officers were instilled with a new doctrine: mobility, initiative, and independent thinking. Secretly, war schools were maintained, maneuvers disguised, and studies on the combined use of infantry, armored units, and aviation were carried out, even though Germany did not yet possess any of these means. In the academies, the old spirit of Moltke and Clausewitz remained alive. Prohibited manuals circulated discreetly among the officers, and war games became the intellectual refuge of those who dreamed of revenge. At the same time, the Reichswehr began to forge secret agreements with the Soviet Union, another pariah of the international system. In Russian bases like Kazan or Lipetsk, German pilots and technicians trained and experimented with tanks and aircraft far from the Allied gaze. This German-Soviet collaboration, improbable and clandestine, allowed a new generation of strategists to develop revolutionary ideas on mobile warfare and flexible command. From this collaboration would emerge names like Heinz Guderian, who would later shape Blitzkrieg. But while the officers silently prepared for military rebirth, the Weimar Republic bled. Failed coups, hyperinflation, and internal conflicts fueled the sense of chaos. In this context, the army became the last bastion of order. The generals considered themselves the guardians of Germany against anarchy and Bolshevism, but they despised the democracy that controlled them. The oath of loyalty to the state was gradually replaced by loyalty to the abstract ideal of the homeland. Nationalism became religion, and revenge destiny. The memory of the Western Front and the humiliation of Versailles forged a collective mentality. Germany had to be feared again. Young cadets, trained in austerity and resentment, grew up convinced that their mission was to restore the lost greatness. For many of them, politics was an obstacle, not a path. However, some began to focus on a politician who, with incendiary words and promises of revenge, spoke the same language of honor and discipline: Adolf Hitler. In the officer circles, the name of the former Bavarian corporal raised suspicion, but his rhetoric fit perfectly with the army's wounded pride. He promised to annul Versailles, reclaim lost borders, and restore Germany's military power. The old guard, which had sworn not to mix with politics, began to listen to him cautiously. They did not know that in doing so, they were opening the door to a leader who would subjugate them as no emperor had ever done. The rise of Hitler to power and the reconstruction of the army. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, the German army still retained the sober reserve of the old Prussian tradition. They looked at him with suspicion, a political agitator without military training who had served only as a corporal during the Great War. For the senior officers, such as General Kurt von Hammerstein-Equord, Commander-in-Chief of the Reichswehr, this man was an intruder, but he also represented something the officer corps had lost long ago: a blind faith in the German revival. Since his rise to power, Hitler understood that the armed forces were the backbone of the state he intended to build. To dominate Germany, he needed to win over its generals. The strategy was meticulous. First, he seduced them with promises of expansion and rearmament. Then he ensnared them with an oath. In March 1935, Germany officially announced the reintroduction of conscription and the creation of the Wehrmacht, openly breaking the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. No one dared intervene. The European powers protested weakly, while Hitler gained massive popular support. The Wehrmacht grew from 100,000 to more than 500,000 men in a matter of months, and armored, air, and naval divisions were formed. The German industry was placed at the service of future war. The old officers, educated in discipline and obedience, accepted the change with a mix of relief and distrust. Many of them, such as Werner von Blomberg, who served as Minister of War, and Walter von Reichenau, saw in Hitler a politician who finally understood the need to restore military greatness. But others, such as Hammerstein-Equord or Ludwig Beck, worried with increasing unease that the new Chancellor sought more than military power. He wanted absolute control. In 1934, after the Night of the Long Knives, when under the Führer's orders the SS murdered more than 85 traitors and opponents, Hitler demonstrated his determination. In an internal purge, he ordered the assassination of Ernst Röhm and other leaders of the SA, the militia that threatened the authority of the regular army. That massacre sent an unequivocal message. The Führer protected the honor of the army but demanded total submission in return. Days later, the remaining generals applauded his action. Soon after, following the death of President Hindenburg, Hitler unified the positions of Chancellor and Head of State. Then the traditional oath of loyalty to the Constitution was replaced by a new one, in which unconditional obedience to Führer Adolf Hitler was sworn, and one pledged to give their life for that oath, making the leader the center of military loyalty in the new Germany. With these words, the Wehrmacht ceased to be an institution of the state and became the personal instrument of the dictator. The military reconstruction process was as swift as it was methodical. New academies were created, war schools reopened, and young officers were appointed to key positions. The General Staff, banned by Versailles, was restored under the name Truppenamt. Officers such as Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and Fedor von Bock began to develop theories on mechanized warfare and coordination between tanks, artillery, and aviation. At the airfields, the nascent Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, a famous pilot decorated during World War I, had been training pilots in secret for years, thanks to clandestine agreements with the Soviet Union. In the Baltic shipyards, the Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was reborn under the direction of Admiral Erich Raeder, with the promise of one day challenging British power. In a few years, Germany had become a military power again. The new divisions marched through the avenues of Berlin under black and red banners. The old Prussian nobility, proud of its legacy, saw how the Wehrmacht was filled with Nazi symbols and ideological speeches. The uniform, once an emblem of tradition, became a tool of propaganda. Young cadets no longer swore loyalty to the German state or its history, but to one man. The army had been resurrected, but its spirit had changed forever. Some generals perceived the trap too late. Beck, chief of the General Staff, warned in 1938 that Hitler's ambition would lead to a premature war. Others, such as Blomberg and Fritsch, were removed due to alleged personal scandals in a political maneuver by the Führer to consolidate his control over the Wehrmacht. After their dismissal, Hitler personally assumed supreme command of the armed forces. For the first time in German history, a politician without military training became the absolute commander of its army. Prussian obedience had transformed into cult worship, and although some officers still had reservations, the majority chose silence, convinced that national greatness justified everything. The new Reich army was ready, disciplined, and loyal, awaiting only an order to test its theories. That order would come soon. The emergence of Blitzkrieg and the new strategists. In the years leading up to the outbreak of war, while Europe tried to convince itself that peace could be maintained through treaties and concessions, a group of young officers within Germany quietly prepared a military revolution. Originally, they called it Bewegungskrieg, meaning war of movement, referring to a persistent advance that did not stop for logistical reasons, though the world would later know it by another name, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a completely new way of conceiving combat, fast, coordinated, technologically modern, and psychologically devastating. The intellectual father of this doctrine was Heinz Guderian, an officer trained in the Prussian tradition but fascinated by speed and technology. Influenced by British studies by J.F.C. Fuller and by experiences from World War I, Guderian understood that the war of the future would be decided not by the number of men but by mobility. In his writings, especially in Achtung Panzer, or Attention Tank, of 1937, he outlined the idea of a mechanized army capable of breaking enemy lines through armored columns supported by tactical aviation and radio communications. The objective was not to physically destroy the enemy, but to disorganize them before they could react. Hitler, who did not fully understand the technical details, was captivated by Guderian's vision. He saw in Blitzkrieg the embodiment of his own political thinking: movement, surprise, audacity, and will. With his direct approval, the High Command began the creation of panzer divisions, each equipped with light tanks, motorized infantry, mobile artillery, and air links. The old doctrine of positional warfare became obsolete. The new army required a different type of general. Officers like Erwin Rommel, Erich von Manstein, and Walter Model represented a pragmatic generation, less aristocratic and more technical. Rommel, who had distinguished himself in the Great War for his initiative and boldness, believed that victory depended on speed and morale. "Time is blood," he often repeated. Manstein, for his part, brought strategic intellect. His analytical mind transformed Guderian's principles into concrete plans: concentrate force at one point, penetrate enemy lines, and advance relentlessly to the heart of the enemy's logistical system. Model, tougher and more methodical, became an expert in mobile defense, a necessary complement to the offensive. In 1938, when the Wehrmacht occupied Austria without firing a shot during the Anschluss, many officers realized the effectiveness of the new military apparatus. Logistics, coordination, and the psychological effect on the enemy showed that the theory worked even without combat. A year later, the annexation of the Sudetenland and the occupation of Czechoslovakia tested Germany's mobilization capacity. The generals closest to Hitler, such as Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, transformed the High Command into a bureaucratic machine subordinated to the will of the Führer. Meanwhile, the field strategists fine-tuned the gears of the Lightning War. The German army modernized with astonishing efficiency. By 1939, it had 2,700 tanks, 1,200 combat planes, and a command structure that combined Prussian precision with tactical flexibility. Each panzer division had radios in all its vehicles, allowing for instant communication between units. The Luftwaffe, under the command of General Albert Kesselring and Marshal Hugo Sperl, trained to coordinate airstrikes with ground columns. It was a machine that relied not only on technology, but also on leadership. The new generals understood that they had to decide quickly, take risks, and trust the initiative of their subordinates. This philosophy, known as Auftragstaktik or mission command, was a direct inheritance of Prussian thought, but raised to a modern dimension. The Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a mentality. It was based on the Schwerpunkt, the point of decisive effort, and the idea that the offensive should be maintained constantly, even if the situation was uncertain. "There is no victory without risk," wrote Guderian. The old marshals, educated in the rigidity of past wars, looked at these innovators with some suspicion. But Hitler, excited by the tank parades and aerial demonstrations, bet everything on their doctrine. In the barracks of Zossen, plans for the first great test were underway. The objective was the total conquest of Poland. The German command was confident that the Blitzkrieg would demonstrate to the world that Germany had risen again, not only as a military power, but as the creator of a new way of waging war. For Guderian, Rommel, and the others, it would be the moment to turn theory into reality. On September 1st, 1939, when tanks crossed the Polish border and Stukas descended on Warsaw, the era of lightning war began. The result would surpass all expectations and mark the start of an unprecedented military dominance. The invasion of Poland, 1939, the debut of the new military machine. The dawn of September 1st, 1939, marked the end of an era. Without a formal declaration of war, German divisions crossed the Polish border to the deafening roar of engines and the whistle of the Stukas. Blitzkrieg had begun. In a matter of hours, the Blitzkrieg went from theory to a spectacle of destruction. The panzer columns advanced through the fields of Silesia and East Prussia, while the Luftwaffe swept the sky, annihilating a disorganized and overwhelmed Polish air force. The invasion became a laboratory for the new generals. Fedor von Bock, commander of Heeresgruppe Nord, was to advance from East Prussia toward Warsaw, while Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Heeresgruppe Süd, attacked from Silesia toward the Vistula River. Between them, like a steel spear, were the divisions of Heinz Guderian, Hermann Hoth, and Erich Höppner, who would demonstrate to the world the effectiveness of motorized warfare. The Panzer I and II tanks, relatively primitive, light and poorly armored models, were not invincible machines, but their strength lay in their coordination. Guderian, who led the 19th Army Corps, maintained constant contact with his units by radio. From his command vehicle, he directed movements in real time, a revolutionary method compared to the written and slow orders of the past. "The key is not the strength of steel, but the speed of the mind," he said. Polish roads were filled with mechanized vehicles, while the Luftwaffe conducted surgical attacks against troop concentrations, railway stations, and retreating columns. In less than a week, the Polish army, which still relied on cavalry and horse-drawn artillery, was overwhelmed. The precision of the German advance seemed unstoppable. Where the tanks penetrated, enemy communications collapsed. Blitzkrieg not only destroyed the enemy, it disoriented them, confused them, and caused panic among their ranks. General Rundstedt, a veteran of World War I, adapted surprisingly quickly to the new doctrine. He led the advance with calm and authority, trusting his younger subordinates. His command style, sober and almost aristocratic, contrasted with Guderian's dynamism, who advanced with electric impatience. When Hitler visited the front, the contrast between the two reflected the new balance of power within the Wehrmacht, traditional Prussian values yielding to modern audacity. On September 8th, Guderian's vanguard reached the suburbs of Warsaw. Meanwhile, Walter von Reichenau's ex-army corps advanced toward Lodz, and General Johannes Blaskowitz distinguished himself for his impeccable organization and disciplined treatment of the civilian population, something that would soon put him at odds with the Nazi regime. In the north, von Bock's forces closed the encirclement from East Prussia. The campaign became a dance of military precision. On September 17th, an unexpected political blow sealed Poland's fate. The Soviet Union, fulfilling the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded from the east. Poland was trapped between two relentless powers. The last pockets of resistance were annihilated by the German-Soviet coordination. On September 27th, Warsaw capitulated. In less than 4 weeks, an entire country had been conquered. For the German generals, it was an unprecedented victory. Blitzkrieg had worked with mathematical precision. Hitler, ecstatic, personally congratulated his commanders and ordered a triumphal parade in Berlin. From the balconies of the Chancellery, the Führer watched the tank columns pass by and believed he had found in the Wehrmacht his perfect instrument. The relationship between political and military power reached its moment of greatest harmony, although distrust never disappeared. However, the invasion of Poland also left shadows. Many officers, especially the older ones, were disturbed by the brutality of the SS and the Gestapo, who followed the troops to execute intellectuals, Jews, and opponents. Generals like Blaskowitz raised formal protests against the atrocities, but they were silenced. The army, which considered itself the bearer of German honor, began to coexist with crime. Despite these moral tensions, the military machine was preparing for a greater challenge. Hitler, convinced of German invincibility, immediately ordered the planning of an offensive in the west. The veteran generals of the High Command were cautious. Attacking France meant repeating the mistake of 1914. But innovators like Guderian, Manstein, and Rommel saw it as an opportunity to prove that Blitzkrieg was not a passing experiment, but the future of warfare. On the General Staff maps, an impossible maneuver began to take shape. Crossing the Ardennes forest, considered impassable for tanks, and striking the heart of France from where no one expected it. It was a gamble that would define the reputation of an entire generation of generals. The Campaign of France, 1940, the lightning victory in the West on May 10, 1940, the skies over Europe filled with the roar of German engines. Without a formal declaration, Germany launched its offensive against the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. In a matter of hours, Blitzkrieg was unleashed once again, this time on the Western Front. But behind that offensive, more than Hitler's genius, was the audacity of a group of generals who challenged the military conventions of their time. The initial strategy, known as Plan Yellow, or Fall Gelb, had been developed by General Erich von Manstein, then a subordinate in von Rundstedt's general staff. His idea was simple and brilliant. While the Allied forces expected a repeat of the 1914 offensive, Germany would attack through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French considered impassable for tanks. The blow had to be quick, concentrated, and devastating, aimed at the enemy's logistical heart. The plan was approved by Hitler after a providential accident. a German officer carrying the earlier version of the plan was captured in Belgium, forcing the High Command to improvise a new strategy. That improvisation gave Manstein the opportunity to impose his vision. Army Group A, commanded by Gerd von Rundstedt, would advance through the Ardennes with 7 panzer divisions. At the vanguard, the names of Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel, Hermann Hoth, and Ewald von Kleist symbolized the new doctrine of warfare. Each one led motorized divisions that were to cross the forests, cross the Meuse River, and turn north to encircle the Allied forces in Belgium. On May 12th, Guderian's units reached the Meuse at the town of Sedan. During the night, under constant fire, engineers built makeshift bridges. At dawn on the 13th, the German tanks crossed the river and established a bridgehead. The Luftwaffe, with over 1,000 planes, launched a devastating bombing campaign against French positions. In less than 48 hours, the defensive line collapsed. Guderian, ignoring orders to stop, advanced with an aggression that astonished even his superiors. His panzer divisions covered more than 100 kilometers in 3 days, completely disorganizing the enemy. Meanwhile, in the north, Rommel commanded the 7th Panzer Division, later nicknamed the Ghost Division for its speed. In just 1 week, his troops crossed the Meuse, defeated the French at Avesnes, and continued toward the canal. Rommel led from the front, riding in his command vehicle, communicating by radio, and making decisions on the ground. His audacity bordered on recklessness. When his superiors ordered him to halt the advance, he was already 40 kilometers ahead of the planned line. War, Rommel often said, favors the bold. The success was so rapid that even the German High Command began to fear a logistical collapse. Hitler, unable to keep up with his generals, ordered pauses to secure the lines, but was ignored. The Allies, confident in the supposed invulnerability of the Ardennes, found themselves trapped. By the end of May, British and French forces were encircled in Dunkirk. The siege of Dunkirk was one of the most discussed episodes of the entire war. The troops of Guderian and Rommel had reached the Channel, cutting off the Allied retreat. However, on May 20th, Hitler ordered the tank advance to be halted to allow the Luftwaffe to destroy the enemy forces from the air. That order to stop, remembered as the famous Haltbefehl, allowed more than 330,000 British and French soldiers to escape to England. Many generals never forgave him for this. Still, the overall result was crushing. In 6 weeks, the French army, considered one of the most powerful in the world, was defeated. Paris fell on June 14, 1940. Marshal Philippe Pétain requested the armistice. France was divided, the north occupied by Germany, the south under the collaborationist Vichy regime. Hitler, in a theatrical gesture, had the French surrender signed in the same railway carriage in Compiègne where Germany had capitulated in 1918. For the Wehrmacht generals, that was the symbolic closing of a national wound. The names of Guderian, Rommel, and Manstein became synonymous with tactical genius. The Blitzkrieg had reached its peak. Propaganda cameras showed Hitler greeting his marshals on the Champs-Élysées, while the rest of Europe was in awe. The German army, which had been reduced to 100,000 men just 2 decades earlier, now dominated the continent. But among the most clear-headed generals, the euphoria was mixed with unease. Manstein warned that Hitler was beginning to believe he was the supreme strategist, and Guderian, though admired for his boldness, understood that the operational independence of the command was disappearing. The Wehrmacht had gained more than it could control, and its political leader was beginning to distrust the talent of his own generals. In Africa, a new campaign was being planned. Hitler needed a front to keep the glory of Blitzkrieg alive and divert attention from the stalemate in front of England. For this, he would call upon one of his most charismatic generals, Erwin Rommel. The rise of Erwin Rommel and the war in North Africa, 1941 to 1943. The desert of North Africa stretched like an ocean of sand under the relentless sun. There, where the heat and dust were as lethal as bullets, the German army would find its most charismatic commander, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel had gained notoriety during the French campaign, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, whose speed and aggressiveness surprised both friends and enemies alike. Hitler admired him deeply. He did not come from the Prussian aristocracy, but from a middle-class family. His rise was due to merit, not lineage. In 1941, after the Italian defeat to the British in Libya, Hitler decided to send an expeditionary force to stabilize the front, the Deutsches Afrika Korps under Rommel's command. Upon arriving in Tripoli in February 1941, Rommel understood that survival depended on audacity. Ignoring orders to maintain a defensive stance, he launched an immediate offensive. In just a few weeks, he reconquered Cyrenaica and pushed the British back to Tobruk, astonishing even his superiors. For Rommel, war was not won by generals who only waited for orders, but by those who could see and seize opportunities. Rommel's leadership style contrasted with most German generals. He led from the front, observing the battles with binoculars from his open vehicle, unconcerned with safety. His decisions were quick, almost instinctive, and his energy seemed inexhaustible. The combination of tactical skill, personal courage, and humane treatment of his soldiers made him a legendary figure. However, the desert was an unpredictable enemy. The supply lines were long and vulnerable, and the Afrika Korps depended on maritime transport from Italy. Despite this, Rommel compensated for the lack of resources with mobility and deception. He used fake tanks, enveloping maneuvers, and night attacks to confuse the enemy. In front of him, the British had renowned commanders like Claude Auchinleck, Neil Ritchie, and later Bernard Montgomery, but none of them fully anticipated his tactical genius during the first years. In 1942, Rommel reached his zenith with the offensive toward Egypt. On June 26th, in the Battle of Gazala, he achieved one of the most brilliant moves of the entire war, a bold encirclement that destroyed the Allied lines and forced the British to evacuate Tobruk. The victory was complete. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal, the youngest in Germany, and called him personally to congratulate him. The Afrika Korps marched east, stopping at the gates of El Alamein, just 100 kilometers from Alexandria. The myth of the Desert Fox was at its peak, but the balance began to break. The logistical effort proved unsustainable, and the lack of fuel paralyzed the offensive. Montgomery, in command of the British Eighth Army, reorganized his forces and exploited his numerical advantage. On October 23, 1942, in the Second Battle of El Alamein, the desert was lit up by thousands of cannons. For 11 days, the British pressed relentlessly. Rommel resisted with masterful tactics, but his troops were exhausted. When he ordered a retreat, Hitler sent him an inflexible message: not one step back. Rommel then understood what many of his colleagues already knew. The Führer did not understand modern warfare. Nevertheless, he discreetly disobeyed and saved what was left of his army, avoiding total annihilation. The Afrika Korps, without reinforcements and surrounded by Allied forces that had landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, retreated to Tunisia. In May 1943, after 2 years of fighting, the last German troops in Africa surrendered. Rommel did not witness the end. Sick and disillusioned, he had been called back to Germany weeks earlier. Hitler assigned him a new mission: to supervise the defense of Western Europe against a future Allied invasion. Although his prestige remained intact, the war had changed. The romanticism of the chivalrous commander was buried beneath the brutality of the global conflict. In the fields of Africa, Allied officers recognized his genius with respect. Montgomery, his most tenacious rival, later declared, "Rommel was a worthy, brave, and honorable enemy." Amid the horror, he had maintained a military ethic that distinguished him from the regime he served. The failure in Africa marked the beginning of a profound shift within the Wehrmacht. For the first time, generals began to openly question Hitler's strategic leadership. The myth of the Führer's infallibility was crumbling, and the Eastern Front, where millions of men fought against the Soviet Union, would become the stage where these tensions would explode. Operation Barbarossa, 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, at dawn, the silence of the Soviet steppes was shattered by the simultaneous roar of thousands of cannons. Without a declaration of war, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. More than 3 million soldiers, grouped into 3 army groups, crossed a line of over 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. On the maps of the German High Command, the Soviet Colossus was expected to fall in a matter of weeks. The plan was the work of General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, and Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the High Command Office. The goal was clear: to destroy the Red Army in quick battles before it could retreat into the interior. Army Group North, commanded by Wilhelm von Lieb, was to advance toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Fedor von Bock, would march toward Moscow, and Army Group South, commanded by Gerd von Rundstedt, would attack Ukraine. The Wehrmacht was confident it could replicate the success of Poland and France, but the size of the territory, Soviet resistance, and a lack of logistical foresight transformed the offensive into a colossal undertaking. The first days were a whirlwind of victories. In the forests of Belarus, Generals Hoth, Guderian and Höppner closed huge encirclements around Soviet armies in Minsk and Smolensk, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. To the north, Lieb advanced toward Leningrad with methodical precision, while Rundstedt and his subordinate Ewald von Kleist captured Kiev after one of the largest encirclement operations of the war. The German military machine, early success and tensions. The German military apparatus seemed unstoppable. Tank columns stretched across the steppes, aerial formations dominated the sky, and Soviet divisions were disintegrating. In August, Hitler announced that the campaign was virtually won. However, generals began to detect concerning signs. The distances were immense, the roads impassable, and supply lines were stretching dangerously. The conflict between military logic and political will emerged with force. Halder and Bock insisted on advancing directly on Moscow, the enemy's political and logistical center. Hitler, on the other hand, obsessed with the southern resources, ordered forces to be diverted to Ukraine. The resulting strategic pause allowed the Red Army to regroup and strengthen the defense of the capital. Still, victories continued. In September, Rundstedt's troops captured Kiev, taking almost 700,000 prisoners. It was one of the greatest tactical victories in history, but also a trap. Soviet resistance did not break, it multiplied. As the front expanded, generals realized that the war would not be decided by speed, but by endurance. In October, the final offensive toward Moscow began, Operation Typhoon. Guderian and Hoth's panzer columns advanced with the last push before winter. At the gates of the capital, the Germans could see the Kremlin domes through the snow. But the cold, lack of supplies, and the arrival of Siberian troops under Georgy Zhukov halted the offensive. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counterattack. The exhausted Germans were forced to retreat. Blitzkrieg had failed. What was supposed to be a 3-month campaign turned into a war of annihilation. The losses were colossal. Hundreds of thousands of men dead or wounded, thousands of tanks and planes destroyed. In the frontline barracks, German generals realized they had underestimated the enemy. As winter covered the steppes, the relationship between Hitler and his officers deteriorated. Bock, Lieb, and Rundstedt were replaced one by one for lack of aggressiveness. In their place, the Führer began imposing more submissive commanders like Walter Model, known for his toughness and loyalty. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of precision and autonomy, was slowly turning into a tool serving Hitler's personal obstinacy. The failure at Moscow not only marked the turning point of the war, but also the beginning of the confrontation between political and military command. The generals were no longer just fighting against the enemy, but against the will of the Führer himself. And while the Eastern Front froze to the south of the Volga River, the greatest tragedy of the German army began to take shape: Stalingrad. The siege and fall of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943. In the summer of 1942, Hitler was determined to correct what he considered the only mistake of the previous campaign: failing to capture the southern Soviet resources. The new offensive, called Operation Blue, was to conquer the oil fields of the Caucasus and secure control of the Volga. In his mind, the war would be decided not by territory, but by fuel. But on the map of the High Command, one point acquired an exaggerated symbolic value: Stalingrad, the city bearing the name of the enemy. The Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, was assigned to take it. Paulus was a meticulous, disciplined officer with impeccable training. He had been Halder's deputy at the General Staff and was known for his reserved nature and absolute obedience. To Hitler, he represented the model of the Prussian soldier who would never question an order. In the first months, the offensive advanced with force. Hermann Hoth and Ewald von Kleist's troops crossed the Don and pushed the Soviets toward the Volga. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Wolfram von Richthofen, reduced Stalingrad to rubble. In August, bombings set entire neighborhoods on fire. The city became a labyrinth of ruins, ideal for close-quarters defense. What followed was one of the fiercest battles in history. The Red Army, under Vasily Chuikov, transformed every building, basement, and factory into a fortress. The fighting was waged meter by meter, room by room. Soviet snipers, including the famous Vasily Zaitsev, relentlessly harassed the Germans. In this urban hell, the advantages of Blitzkrieg vanished. Tanks were trapped, artillery was useless, and radios barely worked. Paulus, trapped in the dogma of obedience, insisted on following every order from Berlin. His officers, including Seydlitz Kurzbach and Heitz, urged him to regroup or retreat, but Hitler had been clear: Stalingrad must be conquered or wiped off the map. On November 19, 1942, Marshal Zhukov launched Operation Uranus. Soviet forces, advancing from the north and south, broke the lines of Romanian and Hungarian divisions that were covering the flanks of the Sixth Army. Within days, 300,000 German soldiers were surrounded. The encirclement was total. Generals Manstein and Hoth proposed an immediate retreat, but Hitler forbade it. He ordered Paulus to resist until the last man and the last bullet. The Luftwaffe promised to supply the city by air, but the results were disastrous. Of the 700 tons needed daily, only 80 arrived. Winter fell on the ruins. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees, food ran out, and the wounded froze to death in the shelters. In December, Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break the encirclement. He managed to advance to within 50 kilometers of the city, but without authorization to coordinate with Paulus. The latter, faithful to the order to hold the position, refused to attempt a breakout. The Wehrmacht, paralyzed between loyalty and logic, was sinking along with him. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, implying that an officer of that rank should never surrender. But on February 2nd, Paulus surrendered along with the last 91,000 survivors of the Sixth Army. None of the German generals who had fought at Stalingrad returned alive to Germany during the war. The news was a devastating blow. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had suffered a total defeat. The generals understood that the war was lost in the east, but Hitler refused to admit it. The trust between the Führer and his commanders had been shattered. In the halls of the Rastenburg headquarters, some officers began to murmur quietly the unthinkable, that duty to Germany might require disobeying their leader. From Stalingrad onward, loyalty became a dilemma. Many generals were torn between their personal oath to the Führer and their responsibility to the millions of men dying at the front. The internal conflict, which had previously remained hidden, would soon come to light when the war turned against them and impossible orders multiplied. Generals against Hitler, tensions and undercover acts of disobedience. After the disaster at Stalingrad, the Führer's facade of infallibility began to crack. The generals, who had obeyed without question for years, began to realize that the enemy was not always on the other side of the front. In the bunkers of the High Command, obedience mixed with fear and Prussian pride with desperation. Hitler, holed up in his Rastenburg headquarters, took direct control of the war. He distrusted everyone, especially the staff officers whom he considered cowardly intellectuals incapable of understanding his vision. Meetings with commanders turned into monologues. Maps were no longer analyzed. They were dictated. Orders, absurd or impossible, had to be followed without objection. General Franz Halder, who had been Chief of Staff since 1938, was dismissed for expressing doubts about the viability of the operations. He was replaced by Kurt Zeitzler, a younger, loyal and energetic man, but soon also broken by the Führer's pressure. The war was led by paranoia. Hitler forbade retreats, demanded impossible counterattacks, and punished any withdrawal as treason. General von Manstein, one of the few who still retained the Führer's respect, tried to argue for the need for operational flexibility. During the spring of 1943 in Ukraine, he devised a brilliant defensive maneuver that allowed the recovery of Kharkov after the retreat from Stalingrad. It was a momentary respite, but the tension between the two men became evident. Hitler wanted to fortify every inch of the occupied territory. Manstein defended mobility. "A general must know when to abandon a dead position," he said in a meeting. The Führer responded coldly. "A German soldier never abandons anything. Never." On the Eastern Front, commanders faced an impossible dilemma. Following orders meant sacrificing entire armies. Disobeying them risked being relieved or executed. Walter Model, pragmatic and fierce, developed a flexible resistance strategy without openly acknowledging it. He pretended to obey but reorganized the lines as he saw fit. His ability to transform defeat into controlled retreat earned him the nickname the Firefighter of the Eastern Front, called in whenever the situation collapsed. Others, like Heinz Guderian, were sidelined after disagreements with the Führer. Guderian, who had been the architect of mechanized warfare, was publicly humiliated and forced into retirement. He would only return to service in 1943 when the crisis made him indispensable. Tension reached its peak with Operation Citadel, the Kursk offensive in July 1943. Hitler sought to regain the initiative with a frontal attack against the largest salient on the Soviet front. The generals knew that surprise had been lost, that the Russians were prepared with a deep-layered defense. Model, Hoth and Manstein tried to warn him, but they were ignored. The battle became a mechanized disaster. Thousands of tanks colliding in minefields, under airstrikes and massive artillery fire. The failure sealed the last major German offensive in the east. From then on, the Wehrmacht would only retreat. After Kursk, disobedience became a form of survival. Some commanders began to interpret Hitler's orders flexibly, delaying their execution or modifying them in the field. In practice, Prussian discipline had become a mere facade. Manstein himself, at the head of Army Group South, ordered withdrawals without direct authorization, disguising them as tactical adjustments. When Hitler discovered this, he dismissed him in March 1944. "I do not need generals who think, but who obey," he told him as he dismissed him. Meanwhile, in Berlin and in rear area headquarters, a group of officers began to conceive an idea that years earlier would have seemed unthinkable: eliminating the Führer. General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff and a critic of the invasion of Poland, became the moral reference point of that silent opposition. Alongside him, General Hans Oster, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, and Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg formed the core of what would be known as the German military resistance. These conspiracies were fragile and scattered. Some sought to negotiate peace with the Allies, others to save the honor of the army. But they all agreed on one thing: Hitler had to be stopped. The fear of failure was as great as the conviction that if he survived, Germany would be destroyed. In the offices of the High Command, Canaris's reports circulated under codes and silences. Loyal officers pretended not to see what was obvious. It was a war within the war, fought among men who until then had believed that obedience was the highest form of patriotism. The July 20th, 1944 plot. The summer of 1944 found Germany retreating on all fronts. The Allied landing in Normandy and the Soviet advance following Operation Bagration had shattered the illusion of a final victory. In the General Staff barracks, many officers understood that the war was lost, but there was something deeper than the fear of defeat, the certainty that Hitler had to die for Germany to survive. The heart of the conspiracy beat in Berlin, at the Reserve Army headquarters under the command of General Friedrich Fromm. But its execution depended on a man determined to act: Klaus Schenkgraf von Stauffenberg, colonel of the General Staff and a veteran of Africa, where he had lost an eye, a hand and several fingers. Wounded but indomitable, Stauffenberg had evolved from a fervent nationalist to a moral opponent of the regime. His contact with Beck, Olbricht, Tresckow and Witzleben convinced him that duty to Germany required a definitive act. The plan, known as Operation Valkyrie, had originally been conceived to contain internal uprisings. The conspirators adapted it to take control of the government after Hitler's death. At the right moment, Valkyrie would be activated throughout Germany, ensuring military power was in the hands of the conspirators before the SS could react. It was a brilliant maneuver, but it depended on an unpredictable factor: a bomb in a conference room. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg traveled to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair, carrying 2 explosive devices in his briefcase. The meeting began shortly after noon. Surrounded by his generals, Hitler analyzed the situation on the Eastern Front. Stauffenberg placed the bomb under the oak table near the Führer and left under the pretense of a phone call. At 12:42, the explosion shook the room. 4 men died. But Hitler miraculously survived. The heavy table and the shelter's structure diverted the shockwave. Ignoring the result, Stauffenberg escaped to Berlin, convinced he had completed his mission. From Rangsdorf Airport, he communicated that the Führer was dead and ordered the activation of Operation Valkyrie. In the capital, General Olbricht mobilized the reserve guard troops while Beck prepared to assume the head of state. For a few hours, Germany experienced an illusion of liberation, but the news of Hitler's survival spread quickly. The SS and the Gestapo reacted immediately. General Fromm, fearing involvement, switched sides and ordered the arrest of the conspirators. That same night, in the courtyard of the War Ministry, Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Haeften and Merz von Quernheim were executed by firing squad. "Long live sacred Germany!" Stauffenberg shouted before he fell. The reprisals were relentless. More than 5,000 people were arrested, tortured and executed. Among them, Ludwig Beck, who committed suicide in his office, and Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, hanged months later in a Berlin prison. Even Marshal Rommel, indirectly implicated, was forced to commit suicide to avoid a public trial. Hitler took advantage of the assassination attempt's failure to consolidate his absolute control. In a radio speech, he declared that Providence had protected him and that Germany's fate was sealed alongside his own. The July 20th plot was the last serious attempt by the officer corps to save the honor of the German army. The Prussian tradition of discipline had evolved into a moral tragedy. The same men who had sworn to obey were forced to betray in order to remain faithful to their homeland, but the price was the total destruction of the German military spirit. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht was completely subordinated to the Führer's fanaticism. In the following months, surviving generals obeyed, knowing that the war was lost. In the east, Soviet troops advanced toward the Oder. In the west, the Allies crossed the Rhine. Hitler, more isolated than ever, surrounded himself with loyal officers out of fear and silence. The rebellion had failed, but its moral echo would mark the history of the German army forever. The collapse of the Eastern Front and the desperate defense of Germany, 1944 to 1945. By the winter of 1944, the map of the Reich was already a field of ruins. From the east, Soviet armies advanced like an unstoppable torrent. From the west, Allied forces crossed France and Belgium. The borders that Hitler had promised eternal were crumbling in weeks. Amid this collapse, German generals fought not for victory, but to delay the inevitable. The Eastern Front was a hell. After the failure of Operation Bagration in the summer, Army Group Center had been annihilated. More than 300,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. Marshal Walter Model, famous for his toughness and his ability to improvise impossible defenses, was urgently sent to contain the disaster. Model, known as Hitler's firefighter, took command wherever the situation was dire. His reputation was based on a mixture of brutal efficiency and absolute loyalty. Where others saw defeat, he organized lines, concealed retreats, and precise counterattacks. But even his talent could not change the reality. The Red Army was already an unstoppable avalanche. Meanwhile, in Italy, Marshal Albert Kesselring resisted with comparable tactical genius. In command of the German forces on the peninsula, he had managed for months to hold off the Allies in a series of defensive lines stretching across the Apennines. His mastery of the terrain, his ability to exploit every mountain, every bridge, every ruin, turned the Italian campaign into a hell for the invaders. However, even Kesselring understood that the strategy had become a matter of honor, not possibility. In Germany, Hitler refused to accept reality. His maps were covered with arrows that no longer represented movements but fantasies. He ordered non-existent counterattacks, dismissed marshals for defeatism, and demanded impossible sacrifices. Generals Guderian, Model, and Kesselring argued with him in increasingly tense meetings. Guderian, appointed Inspector General of the Army, warned him in January 1945, "The front is broken, we need to negotiate." Hitler interrupted him, shouting, "Then let it collapse, but I will sign nothing." As the Soviets crossed Poland and reached East Prussia, German cities turned into fortresses. The Ninth Army of Busse was surrounded in the forests of the Oder. In the north, Dönitz and the Kriegsmarine tried to evacuate civilians from the Baltic ports amid ice and bombings. The Wilhelm Gustloff ship sunk by a Soviet submarine in January 1945 took with it more than 9,000 refugees, the largest maritime disaster in history. Model, true to his reputation, continued fighting until the end. When the Ruhr front was encircled in April 1945, he understood that everything was lost. He refused to surrender and committed suicide in a forest near Duisburg. His death symbolized the end of the professional general, the one who served Germany before any ideology. Kesselring, for his part, maintained discipline until the last moment. After the Italian collapse and the fall of Rome, he was transferred to the Western Front to try to halt the Allied advance toward the Rhine. His defensive skill earned him respect even among his enemies, but nothing could save the Reich anymore. Morale, resources, and command were exhausted. In the east, Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, the last commander appointed by Hitler, imposed a terror-based discipline. He ordered the execution of deserters and officers attempting to evacuate civilians. For him, the war was a matter of moral purity. In his fanaticism, he represented the final degradation of the Prussian ideal. Loyalty had degenerated into blindness. In the bunkers of Berlin, orders arrived late or were already impossible to fulfill. Hitler himself, aged and ill, appeared before his generals with visible tremors, unable to accept that the army he had idolized was destroyed. Daily briefings became rituals of denial. When Heinrich Himmler attempted to secretly negotiate with the Allies, the Führer declared him a traitor. By then, only a few marshals were left willing to listen to him. In April 1945, the Red Army encircled Berlin. The remnants of the Wehrmacht and the SS units entrenched themselves among the ruins. Hitler ordered the defense of every street to the last cartridge. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the defense of the capital, tried to organize a rational resistance, but he knew it was futile. The divisions were made up of Hitler Youth teenagers and veterans with no ammunition. As Soviet artillery bombarded the city center, the last generals loyal to the Führer, Weidling, Krebs, and Bergdorf, awaited orders that no longer made sense. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. A week later, on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of Germany to the Allies in Reims. The Wehrmacht, which had symbolized the efficiency and pride of German power for a decade, ceased to exist. In the days that followed, thousands of officers surrendered in silence. Some burned their uniforms, others surrendered with military dignity, knowing that their names would be judged by history. The surrender of the Wehrmacht and the end of the German High Command, May 1945. The dawn of May 7, 1945, arrived with a silence that seemed inhuman. In the French city of Reims, General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations of the German High Command, signed the unconditional surrender of the Wehrmacht before the Allied representatives. At the table were American General Walter Bedell Smith, Soviet Susloparov, and French François Sevez. Jodl, exhausted, barely murmured, "The German army has been destroyed." With that signature, which would come into effect the following day, the institution that had embodied Germany's military identity for over a century disappeared. Hours later in Berlin, Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the last head of the High Command, repeated the act before General Zhukov. His stony face reflected absolute defeat. The scene, filmed by the Soviets, showed a man who had served power with Prussian discipline until the last day but no longer knew who he was fighting for. The Wehrmacht officially ceased to exist on May 8, 1945. On the fronts, thousands of soldiers threw down their weapons, while others, incredulous, waited for orders that would never come. The last units to surrender did so days later. In Norway, General Böhme capitulated on May 9th. In Czechoslovakia, Schörner fled, abandoning his men. In northern Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz, appointed by Hitler as his successor, tried to negotiate a partial surrender with the Western Allies to save civilians from the Soviets. But his Flensburg government lasted only 3 weeks before being dissolved by the Allies. In the fields and roads of Europe, the image of German generals surrendering became a symbol of a world coming to an end. Men who had led armies of millions now marched among columns of prisoners without insignia, without authority, without a homeland. Soviet soldiers looked at them with a mixture of hatred and astonishment, the gods of the Blitzkrieg, reduced to mere captives. The German High Command, a hierarchical and meticulous structure that had for years functioned as the brain of the Wehrmacht, was dissolved by direct order from Allied headquarters. In the ruins of the Zossen building, where invasions and offensives had once been planned, the officers were arrested one by one. Among them were Keitel, Jodl, Kesselring, Manstein, Guderian and Dönitz. Some tried to justify their actions as obedience to duty. Others remained silent, aware that history would judge them harshly. The surrender did not bring immediate peace. Millions of German prisoners were sent to camps in France, Poland and the Soviet Union. Treatment varied depending on the victor. In the Soviet gulags, many officers died of hunger or disease before 1950. Paulus, captured at Stalingrad, survived captivity and returned years later as a symbol of military repentance. For him, the defeat had been moral before it had been military. "We obeyed when we should have thought," he declared in 1946. In Germany, the remnants of the army dissolved into chaos. Families searched for their missing, towns burned under occupation, and former soldiers, dressed in civilian clothes, wandered aimlessly. The word Wehrmacht, which means defensive force, became irony. What had been national pride ended up being associated with total destruction. Some generals tried to preserve their dignity. Kesselring, captured by the Allies in Italy, took responsibility without justifying the regime. Others, like Model or Rommel, were no longer alive to face judgment, but the myth of German military honor lay in ruins. Obedience, which had once been its highest virtue, had become its condemnation. On May 9th, while the bells of Moscow celebrated Victory Day, in Germany the sound was different, a heavy silence, interrupted only by the sound of prisoners' footsteps and the echo of Allied planes over a destroyed country. The war had ended, but the judgment was just beginning. The trials, interrogations, and sentences of the Reich generals. The end of the war did not bring silence. It brought voices, those of the judges, interpreters, witnesses, and the men who had given orders to millions for years. In the hallways of the Nuremberg court, the echo of footsteps replaced the sound of cannons. There, under the cold lights of an international tribunal, the moral dissection of the German army began. Starting in November 1945, the top commanders of the Third Reich were transferred to the prison annex of the court, a grey fortress surrounded by barbed wire. The generals, marshals, and chiefs of staff who had once appeared in parades and military maps now found themselves behind bars with numbers sewn onto their uniforms. Some maintained a martial posture, others could no longer hold their gaze. Among them were Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Erich Raeder, Karl Dönitz, Albert Kesselring, Erich von Manstein, Walter von Brauchitsch, Friedrich Paulus, Walter Warlimont, and dozens of other high-ranking officers. They all shared one destiny: to be interrogated about the orders they signed, the fronts they commanded, and the atrocities they had ignored. The interrogation sessions began weeks before the main trial. The Allies had organized teams of translators, psychologists, and military lawyers. Each general was confronted with documents, telegrams, maps, and testimonies that proved their involvement in criminal operations, deportations, executions of hostages, destruction of civilian populations, the use of prisoners for forced labor. The word obedience resonated like a constant shield, but for the first time in history, the world would not accept it as a defense. Wilhelm Keitel, Field Marshal and head of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, was one of the first to be interrogated. The documents showed him signing the Commissar Order, a directive that ordered the immediate execution of captured Soviet political commissars, and the Night and Fog Decree, which authorized the systematic disappearance of civilians suspected of resistance. When asked if he understood the consequences of those orders, he replied, "I knew what they meant, but the Führer ordered it. I was a soldier." For hours, the Allied prosecutors insisted that his moral duty should have been above his personal oath to Hitler. Keitel, with a rigid expression, responded, "The honor of a soldier is to keep his word even when the world is collapsing." Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations of the High Command, maintained a similar attitude. He admitted to transmitting orders for reprisals against civilian populations in the Balkans and Russia, but argued that he had not drafted them. "I am not a politician, I am a soldier," he repeated over and over. When asked if he believed that mass bombings and executions were contrary to the laws of war, he said, "The law changes with victory. We lost." Erich Raeder, Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine, was confronted with the use of submarines in indiscriminate attacks against civilian ships. He claimed that maritime rules had been violated first by the British. When the prosecutors pressed him about the use of submarine mines and attacks on convoys with refugees, he responded, "Total war has no innocent zones." The main trial began on November 20th, 1945. Newsreel cameras recorded every moment. The world press watched as the men who had dominated Europe now faced the courts. In the first row, seated behind their lawyers, the generals listened to the reading of the charges in tense silence. Translators murmured simultaneously in their headphones in English, Russian, French, and German. The main charges were four: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit them. The evidence was overwhelming: film projections, photographs, signed orders, and victim testimonies. Unlike traditional trials, Nuremberg did not seek merely to punish, it sought to document. Each general was confronted not only with their actions, but with the entire structure that had allowed the barbarity. Keitel and Jodl were considered the principal military responsible. The tribunal found them guilty on all charges. Both were sentenced to death by hanging on October 1st, 1946. The execution took place shortly after midnight on October 16th. U.S. chaplain Henry Gerecker accompanied them to the scaffold. Keitel was first. He stood at attention before the rope, saluted militarily, and said, "All for Germany." He died within minutes. Jodl followed him with the same serenity. Their bodies, along with those of the other condemned, were cremated and their ashes scattered in the Isar River. Karl Dönitz, commander of the submarine fleet and Hitler's successor, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role in the naval war and in continuing the regime after the Führer's death. Erich Raeder, his predecessor in the Navy, received a life sentence but was released in 1955 for health reasons. Marshal Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking accused, committed suicide hours before his execution with a cyanide capsule. After Nuremberg, the so-called trials of the generals began, conducted by U.S. courts in the city of Landsberg am Lech. There, more than 170 officers from the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe were judged. Among them were Kesselring, Manstein, List, von Lieb, von Küchler, von Weichs, Varlimont, and others responsible for operations in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Italy. The trial against Albert Kesselring, commander-in-chief in Italy, was one of the most controversial. The British prosecutors accused him of approving the massacre at the Ardeatine Caves, where 335 Italian civilians were executed in retaliation for a partisan attack in Rome. During his interrogation, Kesselring remained cold, almost courteous. It was a proportional retaliatory order, according to the laws of war, he argued. The prosecutor, skeptical, attempted to provoke the military man, suggesting that war crimes had been committed under the guise of tactics, and asked, "Proportional? Civilians for soldiers?" Kesselring did not flinch and, convinced of his stance, issued a cold and categorical response. It was cruel, but war is cruel. Condemned to death in 1947, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. After strong political pressure and protests from British officers who had respected his professionalism, he was released in 1952. Erich von Manstein, architect of the victory in France and commander in the East, was tried in Hamburg in 1949. The Soviets demanded the death penalty, but the British tribunal accepted a limited process. He was accused of mass executions of civilians in Ukraine and of cooperating with the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination units. During his defense, Manstein tried to distance himself from the regime. "I had no connection with politics. I only had military duties and responsibilities." The prosecutor, Sir Arthur Comins Carr, replied, "Isn't it political to destroy cities and order shootings without trial?" Manstein did not argue against him, but observed him with the seriousness of a military man who had seen war and who was also recognized by his greatest adversaries among the Allies. Manstein was sentenced to 18 years in prison, of which he served 4. His release in 1953 coincided with the reconciliation policy pushed by the new West Germany. Years later, he would publish his memoirs, Lost Victories, in which he portrayed himself as a professional strategist removed from Nazism. Other trials revealed the extent of the moral collapse of the German officer corps. The case of Lothar Rendulic, commander in Norway and Croatia, included accusations of burning entire villages during his retreat. He was sentenced to 20 years, released in 1951. General von Lieb, who had commanded Army Group North in the invasion of the USSR, was found guilty for the siege of Leningrad, although his sentence was light, 3 years. Wilhelm List and von Weichs, responsible for crimes in Yugoslavia and Greece, were sentenced to life imprisonment, but both were released for medical reasons in the early 1950s. The pattern was clear. The harsher sentences were softened with time. The start of the Cold War made the new Germany a necessary ally of the West. Washington and London pressured for the release of the former officers, fearing that keeping them imprisoned would fuel resentment. While in the West there was an attempt to conduct a fairly civilized process, in the East the story was different. The generals captured by the Red Army were subjected to years of imprisonment and re-education. Friedrich Paulus, Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach and Arthur Schmidt, survivors of Stalingrad, became key figures in Soviet propaganda. Paulus, who had been promoted to field marshal by Hitler just hours before his surrender, was interrogated for weeks in Moscow. Initially, he refused to cooperate. Then, upon learning of the regime's crimes, he agreed to testify at Nuremberg against his former comrades. His statement was devastating. Hitler not only destroyed the army, he destroyed the soul of Germany. Seydlitz went even further. He founded the National Committee for a Free Germany, composed of prisoners calling for surrender. Both were considered traitors by West Germany, although their testimony helped document the internal collapse of the Wehrmacht. Not all survived. General Hans von Salmuth died in a Soviet camp in 1945. Von Küchler died in prison in 1960. Each one's fate depended less on their actions than on the symbolic value that the Soviet Union assigned to them. Meanwhile, in occupied Germany, the trials generated a mix of shame, indignation, and denial. For many civilians, the generals were the last symbols of national honor. The image of Keitel with his stiff neck, of Manstein with his aristocratic bearing, or of Kesselring with his impeccable uniform offered an appearance of dignity that contrasted with the horror revealed by the Allies. The press controlled by the Western powers presented the processes as a lesson in justice. However, in German homes, silence prevailed. They spoke of our men who had been judged, not of the crimes they had allowed. Starting in the 1950s, with the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, a revisionist narrative emerged, that of the Saubere Wehrmacht, the clean army. According to this version, the generals had only fought an honorable war, while the atrocities were the exclusive work of the SS and the Gestapo. Books, memoirs, and films fueled this myth. The testimonies of Kesselring, Manstein, Guderian, and Dönitz reinforced the idea of a professional army that had been manipulated by the regime. This vision persisted for decades until later historians, especially those who conducted research starting in the 1970s, proved the contrary. Declassified files, signed orders, and testimonies from witnesses revealed that the Wehrmacht had actively collaborated in deportations, executions, and brutal occupations. The line between obedience and complicity was non-existent. By 1958, almost all the generals who had been convicted had been released. Some died in anonymity, others became military consultants for the new Bundeswehr. Dönitz, after serving his sentence, wrote memoirs justifying the discipline of the German soldier. Kesselring defended the need for a moral rearmament. Manstein was invited to advise on the reorganization of the Western Army. Meanwhile, in the Soviet bloc, Paulus died in Dresden in 1957 in a small apartment surrounded by silence. In 1960, the last of the great trials was closed. The files were archived. The generals had gone from war criminals to figures of study. Their portraits were once again hung in military academies, this time as tactical examples, not moral ones. In the vaults of the Nuremberg tribunal remained the documents, signatures, and recordings of voices that once ordered invasions, sieges, and shootings. The same voices that, in the interrogations, spoke of discipline, honor, and duty without understanding that the world had changed forever. The war had ended years ago, but in those courts the echo of an army that, by swearing allegiance to one man, had sealed its doom still resonated.